Hi, and welcome back to our study group discussing history of philosophy without any gaps by Peter Adamson. I'm Nerdalliun Plebz, and with me today, Rogério Marques and Grandpa. Welcome back, guys.
Welcome, audience. It's nice to be back. And well, Graham just dropped out. He should be back shortly. And so yeah, he's being back. So the idea today is returning. Welcome back, Graham.
Of
So
course, battery charge technical difficulties this time. Tag.
okay, but it's anyway. It's great for you to be back. Okay, so we will today continue our discussion on Vedanta. We will be only focusing on Vedanta on two topics. The first one is the grammar of Bhartrihari, and the second one is George Clooney's, Francis Clooney's remarks. Sorry about that. Francis Clooney's remarks on Vedanta, also in the context of its relationship with Mimamsa, as he is a specialist in comparative theology and also in the Hindu Vedic traditions. He offers some really interesting insights. And so if you do, you guys want to say any intro remarks, or shall we go with the visual aid slides?
Happy to go to the visual aid slides. All I have to add is that we'll be discussing episodes 25 and 26 of the classical or philosophy in classical India subseries.
Okay.
Sounds good. I was going to say is, while I'd be interested in hearing what George Clooney has to say, I'm more interested in hearing, what the other Clooney has to say, because I think it's a little more intelligent and relevant. Tag.
Yes, of course.
we could find a middle way and have Francis Clooney write the script and George Clooney do the documentary.
Or just bring in Rosemary Clooney. Tag.
These are only illusory different persons, because all is fundamentally Brahman. If we stick to the underlying doctrine that we are going through. So the history of India, Vedanta grammar of Bhartrihari, and Vedanta according to a contemporary scholar, a live person that we can interact with. So it's very, very, very different than just having a text that consists of dead words. So let's go and discover who this Bhartrihari is, because he seems like he's a big shot in Vedanta. So Bhartrihari was born in the heart of India, in a place called Ujjain, and he likely predates Shankara. There seems to be much less confusion regarding the date in which he flourished, so 5th century Common Era. And so this might be probably why scholars think that Shankara's earlier traditional dates are wrong. So if Shankara exists and mentions this man by name, so by necessity is either a contemporary of him or an intellectual descendant. Also, he is one of the greatest figures in classic Sanskrit grammar. Said in the study of language that the study of language constitutes the door to liberation, and well, clearly he's a guy that loves his field. With a deep passion. He also gives credit to Panini, whom we discussed in a previous session, and Patanjali, commentator of Panini, and for having opened that door. He also emphasizes the philosophical importance of the Sanskrit grammatical tradition even more than his predecessors Panini and Patanjali. So we're talking about really a stickler of grammar. And he argues that the study of language just is philosophy. So basically, all of philosophy is just language. So analytical philosophy or something like that. As for his legacy, he wrote the Tika or Dipika, so it's a super commentary of the commentary of Patanjali. So a tertiary layer of text. Then there is the Vakyapadya, treatise on words and sentences. So where he comments on compressed verses, often presupposing knowledge of text, which he is alluding to. Kind of like this is shorthand mnemonic for students or people he is engaging with already know. Not so much for us now, it's more cryptical. Also, he may have wrote the Vritti, helpful guide to the argument of the much more compressed Vakyapadaya. So him or someone was kind enough to give an instruction manual to his Vakyapadaya. In this podcast episode, I quote Peter Adamson saying that other Indian thinkers would say meditation or ethical discipline, or even ritual perhaps, are routes to liberation. While Bhartrihari, nay, it is knowledge that sets us free, and not knowledge of technical aspects of language, but the language obtainable by the analysis of language that can be a step along the path to a higher form of understanding, in which we grasp the reality that underlies and gives rise to language. So he almost speaks like the coder of a video game, and he is in fact talking about the reality, the deep reality of that video game, this video game that is reality. So, if he really is speaking with de facto knowledge, well, props to him. So this is, as I mentioned, this is a guy who really loved his field. As for Brahman, according to the Vedanta, is the single fundamental principle of all things, which is known to us only because of the Veda, and grammar is worth studying simply in order to interpret the Sanskrit texts of the Veda correctly. Language accounts for the division or differentiation of the multiple reality we experience. And then, so one could ask, what does Bhartrihari understand language to be? So I just alluded to maybe language is kind of like a shadow of the coding language of the cosmos, in a sense. So there are these two technical terms that Bhartrihari uses: Sphota, which means points at the implicit meaning of language, and Shabda, language used to represent this meaning. It can occur either in the mind or in actual verbal speech. Language in the mind gives rise to expressed language, like one fire kindling another, is one of the quotes attributed to Bhartrihari. Another is, when you hear an utterance, you also depend on your mental representations in order to understand what you are hearing. Kind of like our mind is an indexing system or database system of some sorts. That makes a correspondence between an experience and something that is already indexed. Then, so the flow goes utterance heard, so Shabda in speech, then a dependency on mental representations, which is Shabda in the mind. And then if the correspondence is made, then we might have the understanding of what was heard, so the Sphota. Then Peter Adamson is, with one of his typical ready-at-hand examples, he goes, probably excitedly, knowing him by now, there is a giraffe in your kitchen. And so, yeah, okay, I managed to make the AI cough up a giraffe in the kitchen. So props to the AI. AIs are winning. Wow, a giraffe in the kitchen, huh? I hope it cleans up last night's dishes. So two mental reactions that came about. So both of these mental reactions point to the same shared meaning, that there is a giraffe in the kitchen, and so the meaning of sota is the core of language. Capturing meaning is arguably the whole point of language. So maybe if the languages that are floating around are kind of like a shadow of whatever it is that is the fundamental language, the Sanskrit grammar guys would say, well, it's Sanskrit, of course. Then if it's intimately related to what underlies the cosmos, maybe that the underlying meaning is really, really important ontologically. So for people who are really concerned with describing whatever it is essential to the cosmos, if this meaning thing is what Bhartiari says, then maybe there might be some avenue to study or philosophize about ontology here. I would also say that only this meaning value of language, I would say it's only in properly used language, because people can misuse it if they use language to lie, deceive, or create a kind of a diluvian flood of meaningless, nonsensical sentences to kind of overwhelm people. It's like an information grenade. And so if people are overwhelmed, they will be, it's like a flashbang grenade, actually, even. They will be, their senses, even mind, not just the external senses, will maybe be overwhelmed, analysis paralysis. And so that's an example of language being used to further detach people from reality, even the reality they have in front of their noses. Also, Bhartiari says that meaning in itself has no parts. So monism right there and then in language when we talk about meaning, and is not subject to time. So the core of language is imperishable, according to Bhartiari. Then we have a quote here: meaning in itself has no parts and is not subject to time. Only actual verbal utterances are affected by time. Since we need to speak one word after another, whereas a meaning can be represented in the mind all at once. A bit like the flash of realization of the giraffe in the kitchen. Then when we get it, I would say when we get it in a flash of insight, kind of like people are explaining to us a complex subject, and they are kind of deconstructing it and then constructing it again until we form kind of like what the Germans would apply the term Gestalt to. So we get it, we get what the overlying more than the sum of all parts of the words and sentences amounts to, or what it points at. So Robert Heinlein would use the term grok. So when people grasp something that is complex and they become a bit like it, they grok it. And then, well, we can't ignore the fact that Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, coexisted with Mimamsa and also came after Mimamsa in a general broad sense. So the rival Mimamsikas, like for instance this Jaimini figure, could say something like, meaning is not prior to linguistic expression. Rather, it is actually the result of a verbal utterance whose parts work together to express and give rise to the intended meaning, kind of like a Gestalt theory of language. Individual words like giraffe and kitchen are fitted together in a suitable grammatical structure, which results in a meaningful sentence. So not so sublime and impressive like what Bhartiari is alluding to. So Bhartihari's response to this critique of his or imagined critique of his would be, that is backward. individual words have no meaning in their own right, but only come to signify in the context of a sentence, just as the sounds that make up a word, like ger and f, are not in themselves meaningful. Consider that individual words of a sentence pass away as they are uttered. So words cannot come together to give rise to a unified meaning because they do not all exist at the same time. So it's a kind of a technicality, but okay. And another example to hopefully shed a bit of light of what Barthiari might be pointing at is, well, you can also say there is not a giraffe in your kitchen. You're still using the word giraffe, but now the word giraffe, of course, is not referring to any animal. So we are also using an individual word here that has no actual referent in real life. So Barthiari would say, in this sentence, the word giraffe is clearly not signifying any actual giraffe. It is therefore meaningful, not just by itself, but only as part of a whole sentence. So coming back to the gestalt of the sentence, as the Mimamsikas were referring to. But well, so here we have a kitchen without a giraffe that the AI was kind enough to remove. So words and sentence and the sentence as a whole make an inner meaning manifest without actually constituting the meaning, as Barthiari would say. And he would also add, the listener, instead of grasping the meaning of each individual word as one listens, one comprehends the meaning of the whole sentence all at once in a flash of understanding, which he terms pratibha, that occurs when the sentence reaches its conclusion. Well, sometimes people even get a flash before the sentence reaches its conclusion, like when the ending of the sentence is kind of accessory. It's not essential. It just kind of adds more details. So I would argue that sometimes even before the sentence ends. We even have in Portuguese an expression which goes para bom entendedor meia palavra basta, which means for a good understander or a good listener, even half a word is enough, because the mind just completes it like what autocorrect does. So we were kind of foreshadowing autocorrect, but sometimes it doesn't complete it as it should, and the sentence or the word that was actually ends in a different way. So we're not soothsayers. We don't predict the future. Then going back to the butting of heads between Mimamsikas and Vedantins. So the Mimamsikas' expected objection, expected according to Brathiharya, would be part by part composition of meaning would account better for logical relations between sentences, such as contradiction. The difference between there is a giraffe in the kitchen and there is not a giraffe in the kitchen is just that the second sentence sure looks like the first, with one part added, namely the word not, which generates a new, completely opposite, antagonistic, contradictory meaning. So kind of really the complementary logic, the Boolean complementary thing. So Barthiari's response would be, relations between sentences, including contradiction, have to do with the degree of overall resemblance between the indivisible meanings of the sentences in question. So the meaning that the kitchen is devoid of any mammal, even including long-necked mammals like a giraffe. So it could even go so far as the real meaning doesn't even need a giraffe per se for it to be intelligible. It's kind of like not a giraffe is kind of arbitrary in a sense, because We would even go so far as to even generalize, because the kitchen was obviously empty, as I showed in the slide. Not even a rhinoceros or an elephant or a hippopotamus was there. So not a giraffe is even kind of like a shadow of what is being pointed at, in a sense. The meaning is even more awesome than what the not sentence was constructed as. Then, there is this these two concepts of what Bhartihari has to say about grammatical features of individual words, like case and gender nouns. Sorry for the typo. Ultimately, grammar is the study of the way communication breaks down. Meaning is unified and prior to linguistic expression. Well, to be fair, from our scientificism viewpoint, the world was here way before we existed, and will be way after we cease existing. And so the truth is kind of out there. We just need to kind of make sense of it, and we use language to make sense of it. So maybe there is some truth to his position, although we might not accept it wholesale. Then he continues. The Mimamsa approach to language would be like trying to understand a pot by starting from broken shards rather than the whole vessel. This is where Bhartihari has a touch point with Advaita Vedanta theory of reality. So this starts to make sense why it has been included between the episode where we talk about Shankara and also the episode where Francis Clooney really gives us a lesson of Vedanta theology, philosophy, and in cultural context. So while Advaita says, see the multiplicity of phenomenal experience as an expression of the single source that is Brahman, Bhartihari thinks, divisible speech expresses indivisible meaning. And then we can even go so far with adding a few more points. Bhartihari probably influenced the development of Advaita Vedanta. So even though we speak of him after Shankara, probably he preceded Shankara, as we mentioned already. His theory does not postulate a mere analogy between language and phenomenal experience. To him, language is the very means by which we have experience and come to know the world through thought technology, as I would say. That this was a concept that I crafted for my own self during my my travels throughout the realms of philosophy, when I started to get an idea that different aphorisms were actually not literally true propositions. They were actually means for us to build something inside our minds. And when we build something out of something that nature gives us, well, that is technology. And so even though it's not graspable, it's ineffable, it's intangible, I thought about this concept and named it thought technology, just for another guy, Verveke, to talk about psychotechnology, a bit more pompous, but yeah, it's more or less pointing at the same reality, I'd say. Thought technology, or consistently and deliberately conceived cognitive contraptions. So to one up this other guy. Even in rudimentary perceptions, like in small children, there is a bija, a latent seed of language which cannot be communicated. And also full-blown cognition is always linguistic. So it's kind of like people have mystic experiences. He doesn't, according to this viewpoint, consider mystic experiences full-blown cognitions. It's only when we can manage to make sense of these mystical experiences, like trips with substance or meditation visions or whatnot, or even overall hallucinations. So it's only when people manage to put them intelligibly into words that they are considered to him full-blown cognitions. Otherwise, they are just seeds of cognitions from the previous point, which is it's interesting, an interesting position. Then he also is reputed as saying our knowledge is permeated by words. So he elevates knowledge to something that if it isn't verbalizable or able to put into wordy propositions, then it's not considered knowledge. It's probably just musings and ravings, but not knowledge. Peter Adamson also added, we can only grasp things around us by filing them under certain descriptions or concepts so that we are able to put our experiences into words. When I perceive that alarmingly tall animal in the kitchen, oh, come on, Peter, you love giraffes as a giraffe. My ability to do so arguably depends on my having the word giraffe in my vocabulary. Well, I kind of don't agree with that, because even if a person that was born in another culture that never experienced giraffes or giraffeness, they would still figure out that it is an animal. It is probably a mammal, furry mammal. It has a long neck, and well, it doesn't fit very well in the kitchen. So even though they wouldn't be able to put the label giraffe on it in whatever language we are considering. So my question would be, is the lack of giraffe in my vocabulary, assuming I was that ignorant or removed from the knowledge of there being giraffes to begin with, preventing me from perceiving a tall animal in my kitchen, though? So, well, I can hardly believe that. I think not. It's just that people would just make up another word for it by necessity if there weren't one readily available. Then, well, current day philosopher jargon to concepts by which we classify things. Philosophers nowadays use the term universals. And Bhartihari seems to deal with this, to be a dealer of universals. He uses the term jati, Sanskrit term for what is translated as universal. Jati are very important to Bhartihari because they are so critical in the study of grammar. For Bhartihari, meanings are primarily universal, and the universal is what we really mean by sphota. In Sanskrit, you can start with a basic noun and then add suffixes to indicate variations like gender and number to apply that noun to a particular object or objects. The example given was how the word actor can be suffixed to actors, actress, actresses. While the universal meaning is what allows us to apply the same words to these objects, talking about someone who acts on stage or on film. So even though we suffix the word, it still talks about the same underlying meaning or the same underlying reality or the same underlying concept. And this is funny because we get in contact with giraffes so many times, and they are even instrumentalized by Peter Adamson to try to explain so much that maybe there's something fundamental in terms of the giraffes. So Lex Friedman likes to say the expression turtles all the way down. Sorry for the typo, turtles all the way down or giraffes all the way up. So then there's this notion of resemblance by Bhartihari. Giraffe. This giraffe is in the kitchen doing the dishes. That one in the study reading about philosophy. Well, we are allowed to say, you are like yourself. Like when one re-encounters a long a friend whom we lost contact a long time ago, or like in an old classmate at the school reunion. So there's kind of like us grasping that there is kind of like an identity between the memory of the past person and the experience of the current person in some way or some form. Also, the most Indian thinkers agree that language reveals the structure of reality, or at least, well, they really loved Sanskrit language, these scholars, and they elevated Sanskrit to such a level of sacredness and interrelationship with what is divine to them and what is timeless, that, well, of course, following from all that, for them, it's not a surprise to hear from them that they consider language reveals the structure of reality. I wish they were correct, but I'm kind of skeptical, because Sanskrit is in fact a descendant of Proto-Indo-European, Iranian kind of language that many linguists try to reconstruct, because as far as archaeologists know, and according to what I know, there is no remaining vestiges, remains of this language inscribed in anything. And so anything that linguists talk about of this mother of almost all languages is reconstructions by extrapolation of looking at doing basically comparative language studies. So yeah, I wish they were right, but maybe not. And I also, at the same time, wish we knew what is, if there is any coding language of the universe, I wish we knew what it was to get on with our lives. As for Brahman, Bhartihari's primacy of the universal at the level of meaning, reality itself is in the first instance universal, and only then particular, just like the big electron of George Carlin. So George Carlin talks about the big electron, and there's a big electron that is only one electron, and every single electron is just a big electron manifesting himself in a plurality. So there you got it. You have an ontology where monism is a thing and also makes sense in terms of pluralism. So as I was saying, individual things reveal the universal. So if we get enough data from individual things that have similarities, we can kind of start to climb towards what the pattern is. Just as individual words reveal the meaning of a whole sentence. Maybe that is going a bit too far with the comparison. Then are we being foolish or something by moving so fast from the level of language or its meaning to the level of reality? What guarantee do we have that language captures the way things are? So back to basically Plato's Cratylus even, who thought about these kinds of problems with far removed in terms of geography and time. And then, well, going back to the interrelationship between these two schools. So Bhartihari would say, as Mimamsa also say, so in this case, we will talk about an agreement. As Mimamsa also say, and in this case, I agree with them, the Veda and language itself are permanent. So the concept of nitya. There is a primordial classification of reality in terms of universals, which are the meanings eternally revealed in the language of sacred texts. So yeah, well, that's impressive. Well, there's also, as I mentioned, there is a guy called Plato, which you might have heard about. And well, Bhartihari, just like Plato, talks about universals, which we could compare to Platonic forms that could give significance to our words and also be the fundamental principles of all things. Bhartihari says, the truly fundamental principle of all things is Brahman. And so we could be tempted to ask him, how do universals relate to this single source then? And well, some scholars try to figure out what he might have answered, that they believe that Brahman is effectively the most general universal, identical with being, or with the class of all things that exist. And other universals add further differentiation, progressively narrowing down this most general universal. Apart from Brahman, nothing is just being. So Brahman is being without any colors added to it, without any predicates. It's like a blank canvas. And then other things that are derived from the universals below Brahman, while these have predicates like being alive, being animals, being giraffes, being in kitchens. And well, one could ask then, is Brahman the only predicateless universal? So this blank canvas of meaning, or as I could add, the putty of meaning par excellence, kind of like a clay that can be shaped in whatever it is that people metaphysically might conceive of. And then there's also the comparison and contrast with also Neoplatonism. And Peter Adamson mentions a figure who we will hear about if all goes well and we get there, called Porphyry. Porphyry, the Neoplatonist author of what we call the Porphyrian tree. But although this view is challenged, that Bhartrihari's Vakya Padaya, so that mentions universals are all identical with Brahman and constitute various means of expressing its fundamental reality. I am more of a fan of the idea that George Carlin kind of expressed as the big electron. So if Brahman is like a big electron, then all other particles are just this big electron manifesting in what we consider our sensible reality, but it's just a manifestation or a projection from Brahman or something like that. Then we have a quote here by Bhartrihari: universals relate to Brahman a bit like individuals relate to their respective universal. Universals divide Brahman while being identical with it. Individuals both divide and are yet somehow identical with their respective universal. So, and then, well, it seems like universals form a second layer of principles which manifest in different and differentiate the most fundamental reality that is Brahman. Universals are themselves made manifest on the metaphysical side by individuals, on the linguistic side by mental representation and speech. So if the people that are evolving language are lucky, they are lucky enough, there might be some correspondence in a way that maybe a shadow more or less corresponds to the object that is projecting the shadow, perhaps. Who knows? Then Peter Adamson would add, is language just a falsification or misrepresentation of the single reality of Brahman? Is our world of experience, structured as it is by language, just an illusion? If so, then grammar would seem to be less a door to liberation and more a ladder to be thrown away once liberation is achieved through the grasp of Brahman. A bit like that old raft of Buddhism also. So yeah. So then there is in Bhartrihari's writings both a leaning toward dualism and a leaning towards non-dualism. So in favor of dualism, the world of experience of phenomenological is real, though a secondary, lesser reality than Brahman. Brahman is said to possess powers for the production of other things and to take on forms when these things are produced, but we can nicely separate them, cut them in two. And so also in the Brahma Sutra and Vaikyapadaya alike, we can find passages to support both dualism and non-dualism. So Brahman, as Bhartrihari would say, Brahman is like a peacock's egg. So peacock's egg is pretty unimpressive, right? It just seems like any other old egg. But then when the creature emerges from this egg and develops, it presents a myriad amount of colors, and it's very impressive. And so this is also a bird that is supposedly native to those parts, and so inspired this visual metaphor from Bhartrhari. And he would complete with this egg which reveals a welter of brilliant colors once it hatches and produces the bird and its plumage. So a bit like what I was trying to allude to before, like Brahman being like a putty or clay that is not colored, or even a blank canvas that basically whatever it is creative in the universe can do whatever with it, or itself. Basically, it itself is creative, as well as being the blank canvas. And then in favor of non-dualism, there are passages connecting language with unreality. In some cases, words can express non-existent things. Something Bhartrhari compares to the circle we see when looking at a whirling firebrand. The study of language is a path to truth, even though it deals with what is unreal. So supposedly we would need to cut through quite a bit of what is technically termed bullshit. Comments found in the Vritti also slant towards non-dualism. So maybe he started as a dualist and then changed his mind, or maybe he never changed his mind. He just held both of these positions as possible or equally possible to him. Also, it's worthwhile to mention that Buddhists and Bhartrhari both agree on the one thing, that the world of experience is an illusion. Now, if this illusion is connected, inextricably connected with Brahman, or neatly separated, is another question. Also, language may distort reality by dividing it, pulling it apart into an infinity of fragments. This is arguably what our intellect does when we try to make sense of the world. We look at mountains, and although the mountain range of the Himalayas is arguably continuous, we might try to differentiate different peaks and give them different names to help make sense of the place. And when people ask for directions there, we mention the peaks by name so as to help people from not being lost. But so we are instrumentally and pragmatically attempting to avoid people from being lost there, while also we're kind of bullshitting ourselves, because supposedly the entire mountain range is connected. We're just sectioning it somehow, even arguably arbitrarily, even though we are doing our best efforts to cut at the joints when we are separating things with our intellect. And so with this, I end the presentation of Bhartrhari, and what follows is Francis Clooney's remarks on Vedanta. So guys, feel free to comment on what just went down and add your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for
Show
the
the
presentation.
bird again because it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's a pretty bird. Just a point of clarification. There was this one slide where you said in favor of dualism, Bhartrhari said that the world of phenomenological experience is real. And then a bit later, you said he agreed with the Buddhists that phenomenological experience is illusory. And but just to clarify, I think when Adamson said someone agrees with the Buddhist, I think that was the Advaita Vedanta people, and Bhartrhari just has some similarities with them, but I think he's not necessarily considered one of the main, or even one of the Advaita Vedanta thinkers. So he just has some things quite similar to them.
But then, it seems he also inspired Advaita Vedanta in a sense. It's like he's proto-Advaita in a way, maybe.
Yeah, could be, I guess. But yeah, there's a bunch of I want to say about what he had to say about language. I disagree with him almost on all fronts, so it's really curious to me how he would argue for his positions. Peter Amundsen did promise that since it's the history of philosophy, there will be arguments, and so far there's been disagreements, but oftentimes it's just he would just present the statement of this is what this person thought without presenting the rationale for why they thought that was the case. So, for example, says that Bhattacharya says that meaning is indivisible. Like meaning itself is indivisible, but it doesn't. At least Peter Amundsen doesn't present a reason why Bhattacharya thought that. He also doesn't explain, other than maybe alluding to an intuition, why Bhattacharya thought that meaning is timeless outside of time, which also so on both those counts I would disagree, but both that meaning is indivisible I don't think is correct. I think meaning can be at least factored or partitioned or divided in some sense, and I also don't think meaning is outside of time. I think meanings evolve over time. And let's see, you said a bunch more things that I'm not sure I agree with. So, but maybe I'll present some arguments why I think say meaning is divisible. So at least, so maybe Bhattacharya did make the distinction between spoken linguistic utterances and the meaning it points to. So maybe he would say like what I'm about to say only applies to spoken utterances, but in modern language models, one of the steps is to embed language into vector spaces, and this is somehow an encoding of meaning obtained from statistical analysis of co-occurrence of words. And like a really fun thing that can happen with a vector embedding. So there are many open source embeddings and many proprietary embeddings, but one example would be word2vec. There's a bunch of others. I won't go into the details. But something you could do is you could give a vector embedding. So I get a vector of numbers representing a word like water. And you can get another vector of numbers representing a word for cliff. So you input water and cliff and you get two vectors. When you add those two vectors, like the vectors of numbers, like just a mathematical addition of water plus cliff, and you take the vector that results from that mathematical addition and you ask the computer program to translate the result into a word, it'll give you something like waterfall. So like in some sense,
what do those vectors look like? Or how many dimensions are we talking about here?
They're usually quite high dimensional. I don't know. I'd have to look up how much word2vec is, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's like 700 dimensional or maybe 16,000 dimensional or something like it.
So Brahman is probably not a 2D canvas.
Like the really big language models, I don't know if it's 36,000 dimensions. They get quite or 30,000 tokens.
Maybe these dimensions go in directions like mammalianness or animalness or giraffeness. That's why there are so many.
So I think concepts like that get represented by regions of space, like regions of that hyperdimensional space, rather than specific directions. Although the directions could probably does have some kind of meaning, although it may be difficult to interpret for us. But anyway, so at least on that level, you can take words and you can factor their meanings, and you can get like linear embeddings where you can do additions and subtractions and have meaningful results. But like I said, I think Bhattacharya may have said that applies for utterances, in this case just individual words, but it doesn't apply to the thing they're supposed to point to. So I think in Western philosophy, there's this distinction between a referent and a referee, or the signifier and the signified.
Yeah. Semiology.
Yeah. So
semiotics.
So maybe he's saying the signified is whole. That kind of flies in the face of everyday experience. Hence why I think the Vedanta lot insists that our everyday experience of reality as being full of multiplicities and differences and parts as illusory. So I'm not sure I buy that reality is also like reality in and of itself is indivisible, even though the language that we use to talk about it is divisible. I don't think I buy that because I have other
Maybe the
experiences.
divisions are always our conventions. Maybe that's what the underlying meaning here is. Although the reality is actually, well, it's all one thing, according to this ontology.
If that's what he means, I can probably agree with that more easily. Like I do think we have some degrees of freedom and some choice in how we divide things up, and that brings us back to the usefulness of different kinds of metaphysics. So different metaphysical systems or different ontologies divide reality up in different ways, and they can be useful in different contexts for different things. And so it can be good to have a toolbox full of different ontologies and use the right ontology for the right occasion. There's plainly some choice involved there. So if that's what he meant, I think that's closer to something I can agree with. But at least the way Peter Adamson presents what he said, I don't think I'm very much in agreement with him. Oh, and the other thing about language that I'm also in disagreement about is he says like all cognition is fundamentally linguistic. And there are some cognitive psychologists in the past who have taken a similar approach, or even analytical philosophers. And I completely disagree. I think there's lots of interesting cognition that's fundamentally non-linguistic. And we can even talk about knowledge that's non-linguistic. So I really do think that my jiu-jitsu coach knows how to kick my ass, even though he can't perfectly say exactly what he's doing. Like a lot of that is muscle memory and skill and procedural knowledge rather than something that he can explicitly articulate. He tries his best when he teaches to say what he knows to us, but it's like a fundamental part of him teaching us is demonstrating the way he moves his body. And if we couldn't see him doing anything and we only took his words, it would take more than 90% of the value of the instruction away. There's my jiu-jitsu coach couldn't write a book that was a fraction as helpful as attending his class and watching him demonstrate how to do jiu-jitsu.
But it's a different form of language, in a sense, the language of movement. Basically, it can even be subdivided to stances and specific techniques that can be even chained in sequence. So it also has a certain grammar. I'm not practicing right now, but I practiced ninjutsu, and I even tried to build notes in a kind of scholar kind of way to grasp or help me complement the non-verbal know-how that I was gaining. But I think that there's some potential bullshit here going on, which is the word knowledge, just like the word love, is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. It's being used for a lot of different things. So we say knowledge when you tell me a giraffe has a long neck, and I understand that a giraffe has a long neck. Fair enough, it's simple. But then you try to say or convey to me in words how the specific jiu-jitsu technique works through words, and I don't get it, even though you try multiple times, and then you just give up and demonstrate to me, and then I understand way more quickly and start to even try to mimic you and train and practice and implement. And so I think it's it lends us or tempts us into putting everything in one category, which is only verbal knowledge is what matters, and all other forms of language, like language of movement, language of emotions and whatnot, is not relevant. It's not important cognitions. So I think we need to be aware of the more possibilities here of meaning, and act accordingly.
Yeah, and so that's actually I agree with what you just said, Rogério, and that's actually one of the reasons why I think I disagree with Bhatrihari. I may be mistaken about this, but it seems like he also, like I said, I don't know if I'm reading between the lines or maybe putting words in his mouth, but it seems like when he says meaning is whole, it's indivisible, he also means it's singular. And there are many examples of statements that have multiple meanings that make sense. So you could speak a sentence, and in different contexts and for different people, it could mean different things, and they could all be true. Or I think that's a lot of what poets try to do, is they try to write sentences that are true at multiple levels, and in multiple ways and in multiple contexts. And it's not just poets that do that. Like just regular sentences can work out like that, everyday mundane sentences. So I don't think meaning is singular. So I agree with you, and that's another sense in which it's not whole. There are different meanings that attach to the same sentence, and they can all make sense, and they can all be plausible interpretations. So I think there could be multiple interpretations of a text, and especially text rich like the Upanishads. I think if two people walk away with different lessons from the same text, that's to be expected, and not a pathological case at all. And I think both those people with very different interpretations can walk away with enriched lives, and they could live wiser, better lives. It's also, of course, possible that people misinterpret in the sense that they live more foolishly based on what they think they learned from the Upanishads. And you might say, well, they've misunderstood if they're going ahead and doing really stupid, ill-advised things because of how they interpret the Upanishads. But yeah, I think people could draw different lessons from the same Upanishads, and they could all help those people become better people and live better lives. And that seems to say that the linguistic utterances in the Upanishads have multiple meanings, not a singular meaning. And even if you just focus on one meaning, I think that meaning can be divided and factored into pieces that get put together, like how you explained, a person who doesn't have a word for giraffe perceiving a giraffe can compose the concept of giraffe from other concepts they have, even if they don't do it in words. But if they do it in words, they can sort of put animal with long neck and spotty fur or whatever. They can have those concepts and put it together and not have a word for it, and just know when they see another giraffe 10 years later, oh, I've seen one of these before. I don't have a word for what these things are, but I've seen one before. So that people can form a concept without a word for it. And yeah, those concepts can be composed of semantic parts. So yeah, I'd be, like I said, because I disagree with so much of what Bhatrihari had to say, I think it would be quite interesting if I could speak to Bhatrihari, like to know
Yes.
how he would refute and explain how I've misunderstood what he meant, or how he would say, no, the explanations I give are mistaken for the following reasons. I think that might have been interesting, but as it is, it just seems like this is a dude who's like
He really loves grammar. Probably his eyes would really open when he would speak excitedly to people outside of his field, like this, and it would seem like a maniac.
I wonder if he'd like Noam Chomsky. If they'd get along.
I was going to say that sounds like a cue for me to tag in, because that's one of the things I was definitely getting out of Bhatrihari. He was very much into semiotics before Peirce started the field, and definitely reminded me a lot of Noam Chomsky. I was going to say, I think if he had to sit here and give a response to, the issues you're having understanding him, he'd probably say, "Damn translators don't understand grammar as well enough." I'm kind of oh, go ahead, Rogério.
They have corrupted the Sanskrit language. He would say probably. Go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, and I know something's up when all of a sudden George Carlin and Parmenides start agreeing on something. Definitely, that's a sign of something. What, I don't know. And no, the essence I got is pretty much Bhatrihari. He's writing pretty much from an enlightened mystical standpoint. And what he's trying to say is knowledge is a subset of other things. And it's very specified only to knowledge has to be that which can be in words. And that's where he's sort of like being very restrictive, sort of in the same sense that your jujitsu teacher, he's speaking in actions, but he's not speaking in words. And that's one of the things that I learned, is to look at words as simply a special subset of action. And it's the where he's dealing with is he's wrestling with the idea of language from a map territory standpoint, is what I'm abstracting from it. And he's getting, it's like the sphota is the territory, and the shabda, and the shabda is the map. And that's where he's going with. It's the that's my cat. Yeah, the sphota is the that's the meaning in the mind, and that's where, and that's indivisible. And it's where it's the various manifestations in the shabda is where the various different maps that we can take as we as we basically separate and construct the world in different ways. And I would say that the most fundamental coding language, and again I'm a little biased here, but I'm going with Plato, and it's basically math. Math is sort of like that substrate, and that's kind of what Bhatrihari is saying, is that once you recognize that map language distinction, you kind of start to see your experience isn't really in language, but we're communicating in language. And that seems to be where he's pointing to is that whole map territory. Language can't capture everything. And it's that crack of not being able to capture everything that's sort of the doorway to enlightenment. And part of his point with the Adamson's giraffes is it's rather interesting that you add the word "not" to the sentence, you've now removed the giraffe from the kitchens. And I think I'll just tag out on that. That pretty much covers it.
Well, I'm inspired by a great thinker. Well, to be fair, it's a fictional thinker. He's called Drax the Destroyer, who was really a literalist. And so since I managed to pull this off, well, I wanted to homage this guy who couldn't grasp any metaphors. Yeah, well, I think Bhatrihari may be counting a lot on the fact that his own language, his native language, he's counting on it being like the coding language of the entire universe, being inextricably derived or very tightly linked with Brahman. And so that there is a perfect isomorphism of what is uttered in Sanskrit and what is the pattern, what are the patterns of the universe, which incidentally, according to Keith Devlin, mathematics professor whom I know and learned from, that math basically is the study of the patterns of the universe. And so if there is a resemblance between our symbological representations within the field of mathematics, then it means that we have attained a fairly good isomorphism with the patterns of the universe, to such an extent that the proofs in math are unparalleled in terms of reliability in comparison with other fields. Well, at least that's my interpretation. Feel free if I said something that's not correct.
You said everything right about the math part. I actually took Bhatrihari the other way, where he's going the semiotics route, where the words themselves don't have any inherent meaning. It's like here when he's talking about meaning, he's talking about the the meaning in the head, the sphota. And when he's talking about the verbal utterances, then he's going to the map part, and he's going with the shabda. And it's like that. That seems to be where he's going. Is the shabda's dividable, but the sphota is not. And last one I wanted to sit there and say is this is a point on illusory, because to me illusory is a key word as opposed to as opposed to unreal. It's basically that they're saying that it's like the funhouse mirror effect. It's like refracted. You're not seeing the actual reality, but you're seeing something, based on it. It's not totally false. But it is an illusion. It's not what it appears to be. Going to tag on that.
Okay. Fair enough, and I agree. Thanks for adding that, Graham. So shall we go forward with Francis Clooney's interview episode, our bashia on it?
Yeah.
So
let's go.
Let me just pull up that slide. Okay, so Francis Clooney's remarks on Mimamsa and Vedanta, especially on Vedanta. He mentioned Mimamsa to compare and contrast with Vedanta. So the summary would be something like the rivals of Shankara accused him of departing from the Vedas and Upanishads. However, it seems Shankara studied the sacred text to such a high degree of understanding that, at least this is my understanding, that he proposed where they were more or less consistently pointing at in what is ultimate, what is self and relation between both. So it's kind of like he was a sort of a data scientist. He collected a lot of data from the Upanishads where they are pointing at, and he was kind of trying to make a summation of all these vectors, so to say. And he inferred something that wasn't necessarily explicit in the Upanishads, which is that apparently that the plurality in the cosmos is only illusory. It's we are the ones that are layering that on top as if it were augmented reality, like Terminator vision or something. If we investigate more deeply, we will realize the interconnectedness of it all. And this interconnectedness, for one thing, is inextricable. We cannot remove it de facto. We can only pretend that it is not there. And this interconnectedness just showcases that everything is one. Like Parmenides would gleefully remark while shaking the Shankara's hand or something like that, or high-fiving him. Francis Clooney also mentioned that Badarayana, before Shankara, argued that ritualists clearly showed that one can have many insights in life and know about many ritualists who seem not to go from the cause, the ritual practice, to the effect, which is the higher knowledge. It's kind of like a pump working really intensely, but it's working dry. It is doing its job, more or less, but it's not doing anything meaningful. Confucius would be a guy who would enter here and say, well, yeah, you're doing the rituals, but you're not doing them with enough reverence. You're not feeling anything from them. So you're not elevating your souls. You're not elevating yourselves by doing the rituals. This comparison between how the Mimamsas were such sticklers to ritual, while especially Shankara from the Vedanta side would look at ritual more like a stepping stone and then just cast it off because there are more pressing things to do. A bit like how the Pharisees from the Levant, Judea, would contrast with what Jesus was saying and doing. So Jesus was being very critical about them just sticking to the rituals, while being quite hypocritical in terms of morality and ethics. While the main point of why Jesus even returned there was to teach morality and ethics that would really contrast a lot with what the powers that be there were doing, and supposedly supply an unmet need, basically. So I found this a potential interesting pattern that repeats itself in history. These guys that are just pompous and conceited, and they are just saying, well, the ritual is sacred and it's very important, and we carry it. So this ritual gives us a specific social status that, well, chances are it's above many other social strata. And they keep on doing this, and they just glance over the utmost importance of refinement of the self, of self-development, of cultivating self-knowledge, of becoming a moral exemplar, and they just ignore that or pretend that doesn't even exist, and keep on feeding on the supposed benefits of their class status, in a sense. So, well, that's my critique. I will carry on. So, as for comparing prior Mimamsa and Vedanta, or also known as posterior Mimamsa, Francis Clooney quickly went into, well, the Vedic texts of the first are go into the performance of the rituals, the utterances, the directives, how to perform the rituals. Their themes are a bit more scholastic, resolving problems related to consistency on ritual directions. They have quite a bit of sutras, 2,700, while on the Vedanta side, they are generally rooted on the Upanishads, and their concerns are more philosophical in comparison. Although we cannot say completely that there is absolutely no philosophy in primary Mimamsa. Of course there is. The themes of Vedanta are more targeting questions regarding the self, Brahman, world, human destiny, and they are concerned with Upanishadic consistency. In other words, to look at all this heterogeneous body of literature and try to make sense of it, and say, no, we have a solid ground to stand on. The Upanishads are consistent. You can all rest easy. And there are also 500 sutras from Badarayana. And well, both the schools are also similar, because in both traditions they have the so-called sutra texts. Because as Clooney mentioned, they are consisting of aphorisms, short aphorisms, which seem aimed at combining, organizing, and clarifying what is at stake in either of these bodies of material. Also, that Vedanta is a bit later, and so although we cannot say because it's later it's superior to Mimamsa, it presumes the earlier. They are also integrally connected. Each of them performs their own social role, as we mentioned in a previous episode, and they are together for some purpose. Society apparently benefited from both without them clashing necessarily head-on. They were each occupying their own niche. There's also the importance of trying to appreciate, as Clooney mentioned, and it's a big challenge for the scholars. It's important to understand the founding sutras of these traditions for their own sake, unsheathing the commentary even, as well as providing context of the teaching and the debates that provided a lively context across the intervening centuries, which is a big challenge. So many texts and materials were lost, and we don't have the spoken word anymore. And so sometimes even in these sutras, we only have like a couple of words instead of a full sentence, because they just wrote down these couple of words as a kind of a mnemonic for them to remember to mention this theme in a lecture or in a kind of ritual form of teaching practice. and now scholars look at these words and they have to figure out where they came from. And for the Vedanta, just a couple of words for a scholar that only has a superficial knowledge of the Upanishads could seem daunting, but for a scholar that really knows the Upanishads through and through, it will be more or less clear where they came from, fortunately. And so props to these scholars who made sense of where these sutras are pointing at. Then Francis Clooney, quoting Francis Clooney, he says, "The dharmic action does not cause knowledge, but it prepares the way for the arising of knowledge. That by the rooting out both of bad ideas, but also of ego, of stray desires, of worldly influences and interests. The discipline of ritual performance, which is very difficult, makes one the kind of person who both is disciplined and attentive, and also because it is so difficult, wants something more and then is ready to read the Upanishads and rise to the higher level of knowledge." So I think he has a point here. It makes sense. I've seen so many traditions in which this is the case, in which there are many rituals or habits that its adherents should carry on every single day. Meditation in Buddhism and Jainism, and also the Vedic traditions, or in the Hellenistic traditions, to muse about mortality and accept it, to constantly look at things from above, to be fatalistic about the past and accept it, to have a more or less wise approach to the inevitability of death, to practice minimalism or essentialism regarding whatever it is we need to conduct our lives. So sleeping on a plank instead of a comfortable bed, showering with cold water instead of with warm water, and body and mind are exposed to adversity or challenges. And these challenges are a bit like a sharpening stones that sharpen the mind and also make the body more fit. This is even, we will see this when we approach yoga as well, by improving the health of the body and mind. Spectacular results can be achieved for those who are persistent and enduring and daring enough. So also another question that was mentioned here by Clooney is ritual the background one needs for higher knowledge? So Shankara seems to point out that self-development that arises from ritualistic practices, perhaps as a side effect of following the Vedas, destroys one's ego, refines one's character, clears one's thoughts to be receptive to higher knowledge. And so this higher knowledge, according to Clooney, needs to be detached from the ego. It's almost like the ego repels this knowledge, like a magnet repels another another magnet of the same polarity or something like that. I would add that there seems to be a pattern here in many traditions that a reversible transformation of having first must happen, so that the people are less distracted with stuff and luxuries or shiny things of life, and then the individual's attention can focus more in matters of being, of how they are actually. And arguably the transformation of being, Clooney mentioned this, is arguably irreversible. When there is a transition here, that the person achieves some milestone, then the person that knows this can never unknow it. It's like when we see a disturbing image, it cannot be unseen after seeing it. Maybe some parts of the of this higher knowledge are kind of disturbing, because there is so much of accepting our mortality when we delve into these types of traditions. Acceptance of the fact that we cannot control everything that happens in the universe, although some people are rife with OCD and they are control freaks. If they remain control freaks, probably they won't stomach the reality of ephemerality, of impermanence, of change, and of the very fact that they might get ill without their consent, even unexpectedly, and also to die inevitably one day eventually. Also, it seems that Shankara's critique of the Buddhists for not having the proper ritual is kind of moot, since what matters is actually the self-development that can be gained from renunciation of cravings, self-noting. I'm using a term employed by Aldous Huxley in his perennial philosophy. So the self-noting, the annihilation of the ego, and overall character development. So basically practices that are equated with virtue ethics. But also one must be cautious of putting away difficult work when one just forgoes ritual. For if we don't replace it with anything even more meaningful, or at least equally meaningful in terms of character development, it might be the ego talking, kind of like the goddess of vice tries to seduce or tempt Hercules out of his path of higher attainment. And so it might be the ego talking loudly and not the higher knowledge whispering. Moving on. So most scholars who look at Badarayana's Vedanta Sutra say that he has a kind of compromised position, that's not so much ultimate non-duality, but a kind of duality, non-duality in conjunction, a bit like how we concluded in our early episodes, that we need to have the awareness to be malleable in terms of the ontology or whatever tools of thought we might be grasping at any moment that might be the most suitable to the occasion. Also, Clooney mentions that perhaps Western scholars, they are fond of Shankara so much because of their training in traditions of idealism, like Neoplatonism, for instance. In contrast, more theological scholars might look down on Shankara after all, because besides him not caring one bit about gods, just like his predecessors, he also doesn't care one bit about the very rituals which might be there to propitiate these gods. So he's kind of suspicious to more orthodox thinkers. Then Francis Clooney also mentions, if one is open to the idea that this is theological learning because it's differential to tradition and scripture, and also open to the possibility of transformative practice, then either in Shankara's version of it or other posterior Vedantins, he mentions Ramanuja's or others, these are magnificent theological systems. He doesn't go quite in why they are magnificent, but my intuition, my interpretation, so take it with a grain of salt, is that I think what makes them magnificent is that they are grounded on quite sophisticated ontologies that come from all the Vedas that underlie the theological possibilities they open up. And then further, what this also opens up in terms of possibilities for ethical frameworks as well. But this is all legwork that people need to do, I think, for themselves by being exposed to these ontologies and what kind of higher knowledge we might derive from them that isn't explicitly in them. I think that if there is some higher knowledge, that might be related to the concept of being open to plausible possibilities without becoming too attached to a subset of them or even one of them in the worst cases. So to become in a joking way, philosophically fluid in a sense. And then he mentioned to see the Vedanta systems in their wholeness with the subtlety of their commentarial complexities is to see the outside of the West. And outside, certainly, the Christian tradition, full-scale developed theological understanding of the world, and to realize that the thinkers of these great traditions of the East, and in this case Vedanta, are our intellectual peers. He even added that these peers who are doing from different sources with different styles of reasoning, different questions in a different language, nonetheless the same kind of work of understanding reality in a whole and complete effective way as we ourselves are doing in the West. So this gives one perspective, and it's kind of like a perspective that probably globetrotters like Hecataeus and Herodotus, whom we've talked about previously, and a bit of the taste that I've also acquired by delving into Chinese thinking, Indian thinking, Arab Golden Age thinking, Hellenistic thinking, Roman thinking. And then I look at the sorry state of my own contemporary culture and tradition and see glaringly what is missing there. Not just the actual bullshit that is going on, but also the gaping holes that are left without anything wholesome to fill them. So it's I think it's food for thought. This I think the worthwhile experience of one exposing oneself to different traditions and kind of traveling outside, even if just in thought, in other traditions, just to be able to return to our own tradition and focus a beam on it and see what's how it works, what makes it tick, and what's missing and what's kind of pathological with it. So even if we travel, even if only mentally, through different cultures and different traditions, and then look at our own from the outside, with this augmented perspective, disenmeshed from it, even with exemplary or excellent terms of comparison, sometimes we see the mediocrity, the wretchedness, the bullshit with such clarity, it can even leave us stunned or amazed. And with this, I end. So food for thought, and feel free to add to this.
Yeah, I kind of liked where you went with that at the end. It reminds me of some of the benefits we listed for starting doing the series at the start. I think we listed a couple of things that are very much like that, sort of gaining perspectives and filling in the gaps of where our contemporary popular cultures haven't equipped us with tools and that kind of thing. I wanted to touch on, you said you're not sure exactly why Clooney reckons it's a magnificent tradition or a magnificent theology, something along those lines.
Yeah, magnificent theology, that was his wording.
Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure either, but I think from the context, the way I would kind of fill in the gaps there was that there's an incredible richness of layers. So they have these just huge and very rich works of literature, essentially, that they take as sacred literature in the form of their Vedas, and it was composed over perhaps 1,500 years. These Vedas evolved over time, and they were passed down through various means, oral means, so singing and chanting and telling story fires and ritual ceremonies, and teacher students, and students were asking questions and teachers were giving answers, and people were debating, and over time additions to the stories were made and alterations to the stories were made. So it's really these cultural products of, I don't know, countless thousands of minds working together. If you think of like an open source project where people are producing this encapsulation of the best insights that were available in their culture at the time for 1,500 years. And that was the starting point of many of these schools. They take that as starting point together with how their teachers taught them to make use of that. And in that context of teachers teaching the students how to make sense of these very rich pieces of literature, one of the things they started doing when writing became more popular was they would write essentially speech notes. It's like the sutras remind me of the kind of thing you might write if you were made yourself small little notes and you were giving a speech, and just little reminders for the topics you need to mention in your speech, but it's not a written out speech. So you might write out a speech, but then when you go have it, you don't necessarily have a full copy of the speech. You just have your
it's
notes
like
to aid you.
it's perhaps like the importance of the oral tradition was so great, and they also were so they would give such credibility and such value to the reliability of oral passing on, because they also had ritualized techniques of doing so and error correction and whatnot. That perhaps that's why they only bothered to do lecture notes in the beginning, just to help guide things, so they could even go further, because maybe with the lecture notes, as you mentioned, they could go even more sophisticated. They could make even more sophisticated expressions, cultural expressions, than if only with only the oral tradition per se.
Yeah. So like there's already very many levels, because even like the Vedas, even the starting points, there are like 4 levels of how things developed over time and responded to things that happened before. And then there's this lecture notes that also several different lecture notes. So there are several different sutras, and they're in competing schools, and they're all criticizing each other and debating with each other all the time, and like sort of preemptively anticipating criticisms from other schools and responding to those criticisms. So like in a deep sense, there's like I guess a conflict and a competition that's also enriching even the production of these like these sutras. And then of course a couple of 100 years later, those really cryptic notes are much more difficult to interpret if you haven't spoken to the teacher and the person writing it. Like the way language gets used is a little different. The concerns of the days are a little different. Like there's just a lot of context that gets missing, so it becomes difficult to interpret the sutras, and you get these great thinkers and scholars sort of writing very insightful interpretations of the sutras, also knowing a lot about the literature they refer to, and then traditions evolving, taking as almost a starting point those commentaries on the lecture notes on the sacred literature, and that all, like sort of the commentaries that we've covered so far kind of end I guess between 500 and 800 CE. And so the earliest Vedas were probably composed around 1500 BCE. So this is over 2,000 years of culture that's at this point almost 2,000 years old for us. Like we're 2,000 years into the future from this like culture that was built up over 2,000 years.
Yeah.
So I think just taking that all into consideration, if you look at the theologies of I think it was Shankara, or I forgot what the Mimamsa dude's name was.
Jaimini.
Jaimini. They're really very rich traditions, and like was like theologies that stand on the shoulders of a massive cultural wealth of wisdom. And I think if we can learn one thing from, say, Shankara, he was very critical of the Buddhists for lacking the kind of discipline that you need to really achieve enlightenment. And I don't know exactly what he meant, but something that I've seen from Buddhists is an underestimation just how much, like if Siddhartha achieved something like enlightenment, if he was really wise, just how much he probably benefited from an education in the Vedas. And so like many Buddhists think...
But this is not glanced over in the 2 books that I read about his biography written by Buddhists. They go into detail which were the Vedas that were taught to him. So they don't glance over that. he uses them really as an important starting position.
Yeah. So the Buddhists I've interacted with think it's a complete waste of time for, like, they think they can emulate and achieve the same wisdom the Buddha had in complete ignorance, like in utter ignorance
they are
of
being
all of
bigots.
the
they are being bigots for one thing, by assuming that other traditions have nothing to teach them. They're being sectarians, and they are not being true Buddhists, because the Buddhas are open to all possibilities, and they should weigh different positions or opinions before formulating a belief. And there's this emphasis by, for instance, Buddhadasa Bhikkhu, who was a really interesting scholar of, I think, Theravada Buddhism, because he seems like a very old school kind of guy. And he emphasizes the importance of Sada, and Sada is not taken lightly. You don't want people in your Sangha kind of believing things at face value without doing the work to get there. And so I think it depends. It depends on the quality of the individuals in each tradition. In each tradition, you will find, I think, people who aren't really committed and really doing their work, because maybe their agenda is something else.
Yeah, maybe. But so Shankara reckoned that, well, it sounds like how Francis and Adamson reports in Shankara is that even though if you do achieve a very high level of understanding, the rituals become superfluous. Like you kind of get the point without getting the rituals. But in order to get there, it's probably necessary to, number one, know the Vedas very well and actually practice what they teach and live the lifestyle that they teach. And like through that and in meditation, whatever, you may eventually reach something. And he thought the Buddhists, by neglecting the Vedas and not doing the sacrifices taught by the Vedas, were not sufficiently disciplined to achieve the kind of enlightenment that that he thought was possible by studying the Vedas.
Yeah.
So
I don't think that's a really powerful argument against the Buddhists. It makes sense for someone who wanted to bolster his position and weaken the position of the others. He was kind of incentivized to do so, because even this film that from the 80s showed the conflict between the Buddhists and the Advaita Vedantins of Shankara. And kind of even represented the Buddhists as being kind of hypocritical. And one of the Vedantins even went kind of camouflage, kind of like a secret agent into the Sangha, and tried to figure them out and something like that. And they discovered him, and so they expelled him. They weren't so kind with him. They threw him out physically even, and he was hurt. And so, yeah, there was probably a lot of sectarism, a lot of unnecessary aggression and violence because of the how should I say it, dishonest, underhanded things that were going on between these rival groups, while they could really help each other by being by sticking to being skeptical of each other with philosophical refutations, etc., to give them to prod them to improve their arguments, instead of just duking it out physically, coming to blows. So this was, if this happened, and I believe it did, in probably many instances, this is not what people trying to become better persons is all about. So if the traditions are supposed to serve for human beings to become superhuman, it defeats the purpose.
Yeah, I don't know. I think of all the schools, the school that has the strongest foot to stand on if they want to call Buddhists hypocrites are the Jainas.
Perhaps, yeah. Yeah, the Buddhists, even Francis Clooney mentions, the Buddhists were talking about you shouldn't kill animals to eat, but you should also be a mendicant and ask for food. And if people give you food that consists on animals, the Buddha said, okay, just accept it. If people are being generous, just accept it. But nowadays, Buddhists say, I don't need to be a vegetarian because other people kill my food. I'm not the butcher, so I can eat and need to be vegetarian. And well, they haven't, I think, done the ethical heavy work. They kind of justify these things even today very loosely and lightly, and so it's I think it's hypocritical. Even the Dalai Lama was criticized for eating meat, and I think after the criticisms he shifted his lifestyle to a vegetarian lifestyle. Which even today there was this big figurehead of Buddhism who was kind of caught in the act of being hypocritical. And so I try to learn from all these traditions, and I'm not trying to impress anyone. I'm trying to improve myself. And as long as I don't try to impress anyone else and stick to trying to straighten myself, I think that's what counts. And I think that if people would just give in each of these traditions a chance and look into them and compare and contrast and see through the bullshit and reject the bullshit and accept the things that work because you try them and they really help, then I think it's all good, and that's what this adventure is all about.
Yeah, shall we give Graham a chance to chime in?
I'd be happy to. I was going to say, it sounds like the people you're talking about are depending on their super ignorance in order to get them through life, with that ignorance is bliss policy. And, they take the approach that they are in control of everything. And if things aren't going the way they expected it to, that's a sign that the universe is simply misbehaving on them. And what I see, the real conflict between Mimamsa and Vedanta is the difference between letter of the law and spirit of the law, where both of them are important. And if you can err two sides, it's like if you're going entirely on spirit of the law, now you're like the super ignorant there, where you don't have to pay attention to any morals, any rituals, anything other than just, what's in your heart. And when you get into the other side, the letter of the law, you go totally legalistic, where it doesn't matter what you feel, what your motivation is. You just have to stick to the rule book, stick to the ritual, regardless.
And then Confucius wants to stab you.
And I was going to say, I did appreciate that Bhatrihari. He definitely had an innovation. It's like you had the original Upanishads, then you had then you had the commentary on it. He took it to the next level with the super commentary. And I'm curious if somebody went a level higher to maybe an ultra commentary.
Well, yeah. Maybe they took inspiration for this in the Dragon Ball animes because there are so many transformations.
I had not thought of that one, but a connection there definitely could work. Tag.
But it's a bit like nowadays we have collaborative documents like Google Docs and whatnot, and the power of collaboration of like-minded people who are pointing in the same direction can produce impossible things, impossible in the perspective of the individual. And even though this happened during 1.5 millennia, imagine what can happen today thanks to the power of these means, these technological means, if we so put our minds to it and our time.
Yeah, something I wanted to say, and conversation just went a slightly different direction.
Bring us back.
the conversation went a fine direction. It's just a different direction, and I still want to say the thing. So, just remembering something I wanted to say. So, like, I think a powerful lesson to be learned from all this is kind of an individual humility, that to achieve wisdom, like maybe one lifetime of experience isn't enough. Like, or even if it were enough, like there's hundreds of lifetimes of experience you can benefit from if you're open-minded enough to go and study the insights that people who have lived before us have oftentimes worked together to produce. So it's not just 100 individual lifetimes we sort of have isolated insights. Sometimes we have the cumulative insights of wise people who dedicated their life to cultivating wisdom and virtue, learning from priors, and then teaching students, and then a whole tradition and generations of that building on top of each other. And yeah, if you're willing to open your mind and expose yourself to that kind of stuff, it's freely available on the internet, and you may be lucky enough to find friends who are also interested in that kind of thing and will discuss it with you and sort of share some of that journey and walk some of it together. And yeah, I think that's probably a much better way to go than just to rely on, well, I'm going to live my life anyway, so I'll probably die wiser than I was born. So, but I think being a little bit more proactive about it and deliberate about it will yield much more fruits.
When I started my adventure, so to speak, one of the thoughts from Solon really struck me, which was, do not age one day in vain. You add to your getting older by one day, also attempting to get wiser by one day. I'm paraphrasing heavily, but he said this, and so I thought, well, this is it's a pep talk. It's highly motivating to embrace some kind of habits that you can implement in your daily life, and that gives you just, even if it's just a marginal addition to some faculty, over time it will build up, and probably there is network effect on knowledge and wisdom. When you see the Stoic Cynics, Epicureans, Vedantans, Buddhists, Jains, etc., Confucianists, Taoists, all saying it's very important for you to know yourself. you you kind of, by summation, start taking this thing of knowing yourself seriously. And even so, they don't just tell you to believe that, they even show you how in different ways. And if one way is not your cup of tea, but other handful of ways are, you have a bunch of possibilities to choose from. And this is like the extreme wealth of human legacy that we often don't even realize. We, in a sense, because of what you mentioned, of having so many of these works even in public domain, available online, the ones that are extant, to be there laying around, and we are basically, just by being here living right now, we are inheritors of a vast wealth of treasure that arguably is even more important, it's even more precious than all the gold and all the nice shiny stuff, etc., that we won't take with us anyway when we depart. But if we become something, if we become something a bit better people, that after a while we might kind of, even by muscle memory, help someone by just reflex, because we've become a bit better persons, then it's worthwhile. And Pericles would say that your legacy is not what is inscribed in stone monuments, but it is what gets woven in the lives of others. And so what we do now echoes in eternity, to go from a real quote to a fictional quote. And also, I want to emphasize that there was so much of value that was lost. It's heart-wrenching. .
Definitely. No, I was going to sit there and say I'm not sure how you get that message across to the ignorance is bliss people, because knowing yourself is, that's inherently painful. Ignorance is bliss. So if they're determined on that one, they definitely are on a path that is not really conducive to self-knowledge. And while I got to echo you, it's great we have all of the traditions from around the world and through history available and all that one, and all the good examples. What I think is every bit as important, if not more so, are all the bad examples, all the failures of lives throughout history. Because one of the things I like to do as much as possible is learn from the mistakes of others, because if I don't, I end up having to repeat them myself. And hey, I'm lazy. I'd much rather take the easy route and learn from others and let them have felt the pain rather than me. Because one of the principles that my father taught me, and again, it's one I live by, is the idea that we keep making the same mistakes until we learn not to make that mistake. And then we get to move on and make a new, different mistake and learn how to not make that one. So that's sort of my take on that, Tag.
To go back to Confucius, he would say, I will learn from the fool what not to do, and I will learn from the wise what to do. So if you can gain, you can gain always if you look at things from a good perspective, a perspective of keenness of self-improvement.
Yeah. So history is not just one damn thing after another. It's
Yeah.
one great example of what not to do after it.
Yes. I think it was Santayana who said, the people who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it.
Yeah.
Let's just repeat the nice things. The Athenian Golden Age, the Arab Golden Age, the Renaissance, or something to the effect similar, but without all the wars, please.
Yeah. Anyway, I think that's maybe a good place to wrap it up today. So, thank you to both of you. I really like these discussions, as always. And we'll be back tomorrow with some Samkhya and some... What else? Something else? I forget what else. 2 episodes. two more episodes.
At least we will start the Samkhya.
Oh, there may be 2 episodes on Samkhya then. But episodes 27 and 28, I can say that quite not a certainty. I'm not exactly sure.
Perhaps Samkhya and maybe, well, we are on 26. Then we have, let's see. Yeah, Samkhya and Ayurvedic medicine. Those are the ones, 27 and 28. There you go for everyone listening.
Yeah. Thanks to the audience. I hope you join us again tomorrow.
Bye.
Nice. Yeah, that's it. Bye, everybody.